The golden-eyed stranger's shoulder was the first safe place Seraphina had touched in months, and she was about to discover it belonged to the most dangerous man in California. Her ex-boyfriend's knife gleamed in the marble lobby as he snarled, "She belongs to me." But when those impossible golden eyes began to glow with inhuman fire, Seraphina realized she'd stumbled into a world where possession had an entirely different meaning, and she was about to become the center of a supernatural war she never knew existed. Chapter 1: The Alpha's Shoulder. The rain hammered down on the glass walls of the Meridian Tower like angry fists, each drop a reminder that Seraphina didn't belong in this gleaming world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Her maid's uniform clung to her thin frame as she stumbled through the penthouse lobby at 2 a.m., her ex-boyfriend Kieran's cruel laughter still echoing in her ears. "You're nothing, Sarah. You'll always be nothing." The security guard had thrown her out of her own apartment, well, Kieran's apartment, and now she had nowhere to go. The city stretched before her through the rain-streaked windows, cold and unforgiving, just like the life she tried so hard to escape. Her legs gave out near the elevator bank, exhaustion finally claiming her after 18 hours of cleaning offices and dodging Kieran's drunken rage. She sank onto a leather bench, telling herself she'd rest for just 5 minutes before the building's rail security found her and threw her back into the storm. The lobby's warmth wrapped around her like a forbidden embrace, and despite every instinct screaming at her to stay alert, her eyelids grew heavy. Through the haze of near sleep, she sensed someone sitting beside her, a presence that radiated power and danger like heat from a fire. Without thinking, without permission, her exhausted body tilted sideways. Her cheek came to rest against something solid and warm, a shoulder that felt like safety in a world that had offered her none. The stranger didn't push her away. Instead, she felt him go very still, heard his sharp intake of breath, felt something electric and impossible spark between them in the darkness. His scent surrounded her, pine forests and thunderstorms, and something wild that made her wolf-less heart race with recognition she couldn't name. For the first time in months, Seraphina felt protected. She should have woken up. Should have apologized and fled back into the rain-soaked streets where broken girls like her belonged. But sleep claimed her completely, pulling her down into dreams of golden eyes and promises whispered in languages older than civilization. In her dreams, she wasn't a lowly maid scrubbing other people's messes. She was claimed, wanted, fierce. She was someone's everything. The stranger's hand came up to stroke her rain-damp hair with a gentleness that made her sleeping heart weep, and even unconscious, she pressed closer to the warmth he offered. When dawn light began filtering through the tower's windows, Seraphina stirred against cashmere and cologne, still caught between sleep and waking. The shoulder beneath her cheek rose and fell with steady breathing, and she felt rather than heard a low rumble of contentment from the man who'd become her pillow. "Mine," he whispered, so quietly she almost missed it. But the word hit her like lightning, sending shivers down her spine even as her eyes fluttered open to meet a gaze of molten gold that seemed to see straight through to her soul. She'd fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder, but somehow, impossibly, she'd woken up belonging to someone who looked at her like she was worth claiming. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 3 weeks earlier, Seraphina had believed love meant accepting the bruises Kieran left on her wrists and the way he made her feel smaller every day. She'd met him at the diner where she worked double shifts, charmed by his easy smile and promises of a better life. But promises, she'd learned, were just pretty lies wrapped in expensive cologne. The penthouse apartment came with a price: her dignity, her friends, her sense of self. He controlled her schedule, her clothes, even her food, claiming it was love while his eyes held nothing but possession and contempt. The morning everything changed started like any other. Kieran had left for another mysterious business trip, and Seraphina thought she'd have 3 days of peace to heal the fingerprint bruises on her arms. She'd taken the cleaning job at Meridian Tower to save money for an escape fund hidden in an old coffee tin, $43 and counting toward freedom. The building housed California's most powerful executives, and she moved through their world like a ghost, invisible in her gray uniform, emptying trash bins filled with more money than she'd see in a lifetime. She'd been wiping down conference tables on the 40th floor when her phone exploded with messages. Kieran had returned early, drunk and furious about something she couldn't understand. "You worthless piece of trash," read one text. "When I find you, you'll pay for embarrassing me." The messages grew darker, more threatening, accompanied by photos of their apartment with her belongings scattered and broken. Her coffee tin lay empty on the floor, her escape money scattered like fallen leaves. He'd found her secret, and now she truly had nothing left. By midnight, she'd finished her shift and tried calling every friend she'd been allowed to keep, which was none. Kieran had systematically isolated her from anyone who might help, claiming they didn't understand their special love. Her family lived 3,000 miles away, and pride had kept her from admitting the truth about her perfect boyfriend and his perfect apartment. Standing in the Meridian Tower lobby, she'd never felt more alone. The rain outside matched the storm in her chest, and she'd briefly considered walking into it and never looking back. That's when she'd seen him for the first time, the man with golden eyes who looked like he'd stepped out of some fairy tale about kings and conquered kingdoms. He'd been standing by the windows, talking quietly on his phone, but when their eyes met across the marble expanse, the conversation died on his lips. Even from 50 feet away, she'd felt the weight of his attention like sunlight breaking through clouds. He was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, all sharp angles and controlled power, wearing a midnight black suit that probably cost more than her yearly salary. And he was staring at her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen, which was impossible because she was nobody special at all. Damon Blackthorne had ruled the Northern California Pack for 8 years, and in all that time, he'd never believed in the mate bond his ancestors spoke of in whispered legends. He'd built his empire on cold logic and calculated strength, transforming his inherited territory from a struggling pack into the most powerful supernatural force on the West Coast. Love was a weakness he couldn't afford, not when rival packs watched for any sign of vulnerability. But the moment his eyes met those of the small maid in the gray uniform, his carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. She smelled like rain and resilience, with an underlying scent of sadness that made his wolf snarl with protective fury. Every instinct he'd spent decades controlling roared to life as he watched her try to make herself invisible among the marble and gold of his territory, because Meridian Tower wasn't just another office building. It was his pack's headquarters, hidden in plain sight among the humans who paid rent to unknowingly fund supernatural operations. And now his mate was here, cleaning the offices of his lieutenants, completely unaware that she'd walked into the heart of werewolf power in California. He'd ended his phone call mid-sentence, ignoring his beta's confused questions about the abandoned deal worth millions. Money meant nothing when your entire existence suddenly revolved around a fragile human who looked like she expected the world to hurt her. Through the pack bond, he felt his wolves' curiosity spike. Their alpha's emotional state affected them all, and his sudden laser focus on the cleaning woman sent ripples of confusion through their ranks. But Damon didn't care about pack politics or carefully maintained facades. His mate was here, and she was in pain. The phone in her hand buzzed with increasingly aggressive messages, and Damon's enhanced hearing caught every vicious word. His claws extended involuntarily as he listened to some pathetic human male threatening the woman fate had chosen for him. The man, Kieran, according to the contact name, was describing in graphic detail what he planned to do when he found her, and each word stoked the predatory fire burning in Damon's chest. No one threatened what belonged to him. No one hurt his mate and lived to boast about it. When she finally collapsed onto the bench near the elevators, defeated and alone, Damon moved without conscious thought. His wolf demanded he protect, claim, comfort, in that order. He sat beside her carefully, fighting every territorial instinct that screamed at him to scent mark her immediately and carry her to his penthouse where she'd never know hunger or fear again. But humans were fragile creatures who didn't understand the sacred bond of mates, and rushing would only drive her away. So he sat in perfect stillness as she unconsciously sought his warmth, and when her head finally came to rest on his shoulder, Damon Blackthorne, Alpha King of Northern California, felt peace for the first time in his violent, lonely life. Chapter 2: The Claiming Mark. The scent of his mate's hair, vanilla and something uniquely her, nearly drove Damon to his knees with the force of recognition that slammed through his entire being. His wolf, usually a creature of violence and territorial rage, went perfectly still as she nestled against him, finally safe in her rightful place. This was what the old pack legend spoke of, the moment when two souls recognized each other across species, across worlds, across every barrier that logic said should keep them apart. Her soft breathing against his neck sent electricity through his veins, and he had to grip the bench to keep from wrapping his arms around her and never letting go. As she slept, Damon's enhanced senses catalogued every detail of his mate. The way her pulse fluttered like a frightened bird in her throat. The soft curve of her lips that begged to be kissed. The defensive way she held herself even in sleep, as if expecting an attack. His wolf whined softly at the evidence of her pain, and Damon found himself making a silent vow that she would never fear anything again. Not while he drew breath. Not while his pack controlled this territory. The human who'd threatened her would face consequences that defied imagination. Time moved differently with his mate in his arms. Minutes felt like hours, and hours passed like heartbeats. Damon called his assistant to cancel his morning meetings, his afternoon conference calls, his evening dinner with the pack council. Nothing mattered except this moment, this woman, this gift from the moon goddess he'd stopped believing in years ago. His pack members tried reaching him through their mental link, confused by their alpha's sudden disappearance from pack business, but Damon shut them out completely. For the first time in his life, the needs of his pack came second to something else. When dawn began painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Damon felt his mate stirring against him. Her breathing changed, becoming lighter, and he knew she was floating back to consciousness. Every possessive instinct in his body demanded he claim her properly, mark her throat with his teeth so every supernatural creature in California would know she belonged to the Alpha King. But humans didn't understand such things, and he couldn't risk frightening her away before she learned to trust him. So instead, he allowed himself one small claiming, a whispered word that his wolf demanded he speak. Mine, he breathed against her hair, the word carrying the weight of ancient magic and unbreakable bonds. The moment it left his lips, something fundamental shifted in the universe. He felt the mate bonds snap into place like a golden thread connecting their souls, invisible to her but blazing like the sun to his supernatural senses. When her eyes fluttered open, beautiful brown eyes that held depths of strength she didn't even know she possessed, Damon looked into them and saw his future, his purpose, his everything. She was awake, she was his, and nothing in heaven or hell would ever separate them again. Seraphina's world tilted as she stared into eyes that seemed lit from within by molten gold, beautiful and terrifying in their intensity. The stranger who became her pillow was the most magnificent man she'd ever seen, all dark hair and sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it knew secrets worth dying for. But it was his eyes that held her captive, ancient and knowing in a face too young to carry such weight. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that bypassed every defense she'd built around her heart, as if he could read the story of every scar, every disappointment, every moment of loneliness that had led her to this bench. "I'm sorry," she whispered, starting to pull away from the warmth that had sheltered her through the night. But his hand, large and surprisingly gentle, came up to cup her cheek, and the simple touch sent lightning through her entire nervous system. She should have been afraid. should have recognized the predatory stillness in the way he watched her, like a hunter who'd finally found his prey. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months, as if this dangerous stranger's presence could shield her from every storm the world might throw her way. "Don't apologize," he said, and his voice was rough velvet that made her stomach flutter with something that definitely wasn't fear. "What's your name?" The question was simple, but the way he asked it, like her answer would reshape his entire existence, made her breath catch. When she told him, he repeated it slowly, like he was tasting each syllable. Seraphina. The way her name sounded in his deep voice made her feel precious, important, worthy of something more than the scraps of affection Kieran had thrown her way. Her phone buzzed against her leg, shattering the spell that had woven itself around them. Kieran's name flashed on the screen, followed by a string of messages that made her blood freeze. He'd found her location somehow, probably through the building's security cameras, and was on his way. "I have to go," she said, panic making her voice thin and breathless. But when she tried to stand, the stranger's hand closed gently but firmly around her wrist, and she felt a strange tingling where his skin touched hers, like static electricity but warmer, more alive. "Who is he?" the man asked, and there was something dangerous threading through his voice now, something that made the air around them feel charged with electricity. When Seraphina hesitated, his thumb traced soothing circles over her pulse point, and the gentleness of the gesture made her want to cry. "Tell me who hurt you, Seraphina. Let me help." The offer was everything she'd dreamed of during the long, lonely nights in Kieran's apartment, someone strong enough to stand between her and the world, someone who looked at her like she was worth protecting. But fairy tales didn't happen to girls like her, and beautiful strangers with golden eyes didn't rescue lowly maids from their mistakes. Before Seraphina could answer, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded like a death knell in the sudden tension of the lobby. Kieran stepped out, his expensive clothes wrinkled from the flight, his eyes bloodshot with alcohol and rage. He spotted her immediately, his gaze zeroing in on her like a missile lock, and the cruel smile that spread across his face made her stomach turn to ice. But then his attention shifted to the man beside her, and something flickered across his features, surprise, then calculation, then the kind of nervous aggression that came from recognizing a superior predator. The moment Kieran's presence filled the space, Seraphina felt something strange stirring deep within her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with Damon's protective presence and everything to do with something ancient awakening in her blood. The sensation was subtle at first, like the flutter of butterfly wings against her ribcage, but it grew stronger as Kieran's threatening energy pressed against her like a physical weight. She pressed closer to Damon instinctively, seeking the safety of his strength, but the warmth inside her pulsed in rhythm with her racing heartbeat, as if responding to the danger with power she didn't know she possessed. "There you are, baby," Kieran said, his voice carrying that false sweetness he used when other people were watching. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Time to come home." He started walking toward them with the confident stride of a man who'd never been told no, but something made him slow, then stop completely. The stranger beside Seraphina hadn't moved, hadn't even looked in Kieran's direction, but the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 10 degrees. The lights flickered once, casting strange shadows across the marble floor. Damon could sense the change in his mate before she even realized it herself. Through their newly formed bond, he felt the ancient power stirring in her bloodstream like liquid starlight, responding to the threat with an instinctive protectiveness that made his wolf howl with recognition. This wasn't the reaction of a helpless human, this was the awakening of something far older and more powerful than even his alpha heritage. His enhanced senses caught the shift in her scent, the way her natural vanilla sweetness now carried undertones of moonlight and wild magic that spoke of bloodlines thought extinct for 3 centuries. "She's not going anywhere with you," the golden-eyed man said quietly, and though his words were soft, they carried a weight that made the glass windows vibrate slightly in their frames. When he finally turned to look at Kieran, Seraphina saw something impossible flicker through his expression, his eyes flashed brighter, more golden, almost glowing in the early morning light. For just a moment, his canine teeth looked longer, sharper, and she felt power radiating from him like heat from a furnace. The force of his alpha dominance rolled through the lobby like an invisible tsunami, pressing against every surface, every breath of air, every heartbeat in the space. The power that emanated from Damon hit Seraphina like a physical force, but instead of making her cower or flee, it called to something deep in her DNA that had been sleeping for generations. The warmth in her chest exploded outward, racing through her veins like liquid silver, and for one brief, impossible moment, her reflection in the polished marble columns showed eyes that blazed with pure moonlight, silver fire that spoke of royal bloodlines and divine connections that predated every pack, every territory, every supernatural hierarchy in existence. The flash lasted only a heartbeat, gone so quickly that she remained completely unaware of what had just awakened within her. But Damon saw it. Through their mate bond, through his enhanced alpha senses, through the ancient recognition that howled in his very soul, he witnessed the moment when the last daughter of the moon goddess's chosen bloodline began to remember what she truly was. The sight hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees threaten to buckle with the sheer impossibility of what fate had delivered into his arms. His mate wasn't human, she was Linares nobility, descended from the silver-eyed wolves who had ruled before the Great Purge, before the old bloodlines were hunted to extinction by fearful lesser packs who couldn't bear to serve beings touched by divine grace. Kieran tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained and brittle as the combined pressure of Damon's alpha dominance and Seraphina's unconscious power manifestation pressed against his human nervous system like crushing weight. "And who the hell are you to tell me what my girlfriend does?" He took another step forward, then froze as the stranger rose to his feet. The man was tall, taller than Kieran by at least 6 inches, and built like someone who'd never lost a fight in his life. When he smiled, showing those slightly too sharp teeth, Kieran actually stumbled backward. "She's under my protection now," the stranger said, and the words rang with finality that seemed to echo off the marble walls. The ancient power flowing through Seraphina's veins responded to the threat Kieran represented with increasing intensity, and though she couldn't see or understand what was happening to her, she felt strength flooding her limbs that had nothing to do with adrenaline or fear. Her spine straightened with unconscious regality, her chin lifted with an authority she'd never known she possessed, and when she looked at Kieran, something in her gaze made him take another involuntary step backward. The silver fire in her eyes was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but the power remained, humming beneath her skin like electricity waiting to be unleashed. "Damon," Seraphina whispered, the name falling from her lips though she had no memory of him telling her. But somehow she knew, just like she'd known his shoulder was safe, just like she'd known his touch would burn away every cruel word Kieran had ever whispered in her ear. The knowledge came from the same place as the warmth in her chest, the same ancient source that was teaching her things her conscious mind couldn't yet accept. "My name is Damon," he confirmed, never taking his eyes off Kieran, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to drop to one knee before his mate and acknowledge what she truly was. The revelation of Seraphina's true heritage crashed through Damon's consciousness like a tidal wave, rewriting everything he thought he knew about their bond, about fate, about the reason the moon goddess had chosen them for each other. Linares bloodline, the silver-eyed nobility who had ruled the supernatural world when it was young, whose power came not from dominance or territory but from their direct connection to the divine forces that governed werewolf existence. They were the bloodline of peacemakers and kingdom builders, of queens who could command the loyalty of entire continents through wisdom rather than force. And they had been systematically hunted to extinction centuries ago by jealous alphas who feared their ability to unite the fractured supernatural world under a single, benevolent rule. "And you're going to walk back into that elevator, leave this building, and never come near Seraphina again. Because if you do," his voice dropped to something that wasn't quite human anymore, something that made Seraphina's primitive hindbrain scream warnings about apex predators and ancient dangers. But even as he spoke, Damon's mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. If word got out that the Linares bloodline had survived, that the last silver-eyed heir was alive and awakening to her power, every pack in North America would mobilize. Some would try to claim her, to use her divine authority to legitimize their own rule. Others would try to eliminate her before she could challenge their carefully maintained power structures. All of them would see her as either a tool to be controlled or a threat to be destroyed. The silver fire that had briefly blazed in Seraphina's eyes was more than just a sign of supernatural heritage. It was proof that she carried the complete genetic legacy of the moon goddess's chosen line. According to the old legends, the silver-eyed queens could do more than just command loyalty from other werewolves. They could heal rifts between packs with a touch, could sense truth and deception with perfect clarity, could channel the moon goddess's own power to bring peace to conflicts that had raged for generations. In the right hands, such abilities could reshape the supernatural world. In the wrong hands, they could be used to justify conquest and domination on a scale never before seen. Kieran's face had gone pale as he finally began to understand that he was caught between forces beyond his human comprehension. The pressure in the lobby continued to build, fed by Damon's alpha dominance and Seraphina's unconscious power response, until the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural energy. The lights flickered more rapidly now, and hairline cracks appeared in the marble floor beneath their feet as the building itself struggled to contain the clash of ancient powers. When Kieran tried to speak again, his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you people?" "I'll show you exactly what happens to men who hurt what belongs to me," Damon finished, his threat carrying the weight of centuries of alpha authority backed by the dawning recognition that he wasn't just protecting his mate, he was protecting the future queen of the supernatural world. The woman standing behind him, still unaware of her true nature, carried enough divine power in her bloodstream to either unite or destroy every werewolf pack in existence. And she had chosen him as her mate, had accepted his protection and his claim, binding their destinies together in ways that would reshape the balance of power across the entire continent. But with that recognition came a terrible responsibility. How could he tell her what she truly was? How could he explain that the lonely maid who'd fallen asleep on his shoulder was actually supernatural royalty whose very existence would make her a target for every ambitious alpha and power-hungry pack leader in the world? The mate bond between them was no longer just about love and companionship, it was about protecting the most important werewolf alive from forces that would kill to possess or destroy her. Every moment she remained ignorant of her heritage was another moment of safety, but also another moment when her powers could manifest unpredictably, potentially exposing her to enemies who had spent centuries believing her bloodline was extinct. As if sensing his internal turmoil, Seraphina reached out and touched his arm gently, and the contact sent another surge of silver fire through the mate bond, power that recognized power, divinity calling to strength, the moon goddess's chosen daughter accepting the protection of the alpha who had been fated to stand at her side. The touch was innocent, meant only to comfort and support, but it carried implications that made Damon's wolf howl with equal parts triumph and terror. His mate trusted him completely, had no idea that her simple gesture of affection had just confirmed her royal status to any supernatural creature sensitive enough to feel the energy radiating from their bond. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, filled with unspoken promises and deadly secrets that could change everything if revealed too soon. Kieran stood frozen in the grip of powers he couldn't understand, while Seraphina remained blissfully unaware that she had just unconsciously claimed the most powerful alpha in California as her protector and consort. And Damon stood caught between his love for his mate and his duty to keep her safe, knowing that every second of ignorance he allowed her was both a gift and a curse that brought them closer to the moment when her true nature would be revealed and their peaceful existence would shatter forever. The silver fire in her eyes had lasted only a heartbeat, but it had been enough to confirm what the mate bond had whispered to him from the very beginning, that their connection was more than chance, more than simple attraction, more than even the sacred bond that linked werewolf mates across distance and time. It was destiny written in starlight and sealed with divine power, the fulfillment of prophecies spoken when the world was young and the moon goddess walked among her chosen children. His mate was the key to either salvation or destruction for every supernatural creature alive, and she had no idea that the fate of their entire world now rested in her small, gentle hands. Chapter 3: The Alpha's Declaration. Kieran's face flushed red with the kind of rage that came from having his authority challenged in front of his possession. "She doesn't belong to you," he snarled, reaching into his jacket for something that made Damon go utterly still. "She belongs to me. I own her apartment, her job, everything she has. Without me, she's nothing but gutter trash." He pulled out a switchblade, the metal catching the morning light as he flicked it open with practiced ease. "So why don't you mind your own business before I cut that pretty face of yours?" The moment the blade appeared, Seraphina felt the world shift around them. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against her skin like the weight of an approaching storm. Damon's hand moved to her shoulder, gently but firmly pushing her behind him, and she felt something wild and protective radiating from his touch. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made her bones vibrate with recognition. "You just made a very serious mistake," he said, and now there was no hiding the inhuman quality that edged his words like silver flames. But as Kieran raised the weapon, something far more sinister than simple violence filled the air. Damon's nostrils flared as he caught a scent that shouldn't exist, the unmistakable musk of wolf beneath Kieran's human facade, threaded with the acrid smell of deception and carefully maintained lies. The revelation hit Damon like a physical blow, rewriting everything he thought he knew about this confrontation. This wasn't just an abusive human ex-boyfriend driven by possessive rage. This was something far more dangerous, far more calculated, and infinitely more threatening to both his mate and his pack. The scent told a story that made Damon's blood run cold with implications. Kieran carried the distinctive marker of the Eastern Territories, specifically the Shadowmere Pack, a collection of rogues and outcasts who specialized in infiltration and psychological warfare. But more than that, he carried the scent of recent contact with multiple pack members, the lingering traces of shared meals and strategic planning sessions that spoke of coordination and long-term surveillance. This wasn't a crime of passion or even simple abuse. This was an operation that had been planned for months, possibly years. Kieran lunged forward with the knife, probably expecting to catch this interfering stranger off guard. Instead, Damon moved with a speed that defied human physics, catching Kieran's wrist mid-strike and twisting until the blade clattered to the marble floor. The sound echoed through the lobby like a gunshot, followed by Kieran's scream of pain as something in his wrist made a wet snapping sound. But when Damon's grip tightened around Kieran's arm, his enhanced senses detected the telltale density of werewolf bone structure beneath the carefully maintained human appearance. Damon hadn't just stopped an attack, he'd exposed a deception that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. "I tried to be civilized," Damon said, his grip tightening until Kieran dropped to his knees, whimpering. "I tried to give you a chance to walk away with your life. But you threatened her with a weapon, and that's where my patience ends." His eyes were blazing now, definitely glowing, and Seraphina saw something impossible ripple across his features, as if something wild and powerful was trying to break free from his human skin. But Damon's attention was focused entirely on the man writhing in his grasp, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd discovered. "Do you know what I am, Kieran?" The question carried layers of meaning that only another werewolf would understand. Damon wasn't just revealing his supernatural nature, he was demanding to know how much Kieran already knew, how long he'd been aware that he was dealing with the alpha of the Northern California pack. The way Kieran's pupils dilated with fear rather than confusion confirmed Damon's worst suspicions. This confrontation had been anticipated, planned for, possibly even desired by whoever had sent Kieran to infiltrate Seraphina's life. "Or should I ask," Damon continued, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that made the marble walls seem to lean in closer, "what pack sent you to hunt my mate?" The words hit the lobby like a thunderclap, and Kieran's carefully maintained human facade finally began to crack. His sense shifted, becoming more distinctly lupin as stress hormones flooded his system, and his eyes flashed briefly with the golden glow that marked him as a creature of supernatural heritage. The truth was written in his body language, his pheromone signature, his inability to meet Damon's predatory gaze. Seraphina felt the bottom drop out of her world as she processed what she was hearing. Pack. Hunt. Mate. The words swirled around her like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to complete, because completing it would mean accepting that everything she'd believed about her relationship with Kieran had been a carefully constructed lie. The man who'd claimed to love her, who'd moved her into his apartment and promised her a better life, had been hunting her like prey from the very beginning. The romantic dinners, the sweet words, the gradual isolation from her friends, all of it had been part of some supernatural conspiracy she couldn't begin to understand. Before Kieran could answer, Damon's free hand shot out and gripped his throat, lifting him slightly off the ground. "I am Damon Blackthorne, Alpha of the Northern California Pack, and you just threatened my mate in my own territory." The words hit Seraphina like physical blows. Alpha, pack, mate, concepts that belonged in fairy tales and fantasy novels, not in the marble lobby of a Los Angeles office building. But as she watched Damon hold a grown man in the air with one hand, as she saw his eyes burn with inhuman fire, as she felt power crackling through the air like electricity before a lightning strike, Seraphina realized that everything she'd thought she knew about the world was about to change forever. But more importantly, Damon continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could bring entire armies to their knees. "You're going to tell me exactly how long you've been watching her, who sent you, and what your pack's ultimate objective was in placing you so close to a bloodline they should have known was under my protection." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of strategic thinking that spoke to his role as not just a predator, but a leader responsible for the safety of hundreds of supernatural beings. Kieran's human mask slipped completely as survival instincts older than civilization took over. His features shifted subtly, becoming more angular, more predatory, and when he spoke, his voice carried the distinctive growl of a wolf forced into submission. "You don't understand what she is," he gasped, his words coming out in desperate bursts as Damon's grip threatened to crush his windpipe. The Shadowmere Pack has been tracking bloodline markers for decades. When the sense signatures started appearing in the California databases, we knew something had survived the purge. The revelation sent ice through Damon's veins. The purge, the systematic elimination of the Linares bloodline 3 centuries ago, was supposed to have been complete, absolute, final. Every silver-eyed heir had been hunted down and killed, their divine connection to the moon goddess severed forever to prevent them from uniting the fractured supernatural world under a single, benevolent rule. The fact that Kieran's pack had been actively searching for survivors meant that other factions knew the truth as well. Seraphina wasn't just in danger from random supernatural threats, she was the target of organized, coordinated efforts that spanned multiple territories and possibly multiple species. "She doesn't know, does she?" Kieran continued, his eyes flicking towards Seraphina with a mixture of hunger and calculation that made Damon's protective instincts roar with homicidal fury. "The little princess has no idea what kind of power runs through her veins. No idea that every major pack in North America would kill to control her, or that others would kill to make sure she never awakens to her full potential. We were supposed to keep her docile, compliant, unaware of her heritage until the council decided how to best utilize her abilities." The words hit Seraphina like sledgehammer blows, each revelation more impossible than the last. Princess. Power. Heritage. Bloodline. The concepts swirled around her consciousness like fragments of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The warm, protective presence she'd felt stirring in her chest during moments of stress suddenly took on new meaning, and she found herself remembering dozens of small incidents over the years, times when her instincts had guided her away from danger, when she'd known things she shouldn't have known, when people had looked at her with a mixture of reverence and fear that she'd never been able to understand. "The Shadowmere Pack specializes in long-term infiltration," Kieran continued, desperation making him careless with information that should have died with him. We've had operatives embedded in major cities across the continent for years, watching for signs of awakening Linares bloodlines. When Seraphina's sense signatures began manifesting stronger emotional responses in local werewolf populations, we knew we'd found something significant. The mission was to establish control, prevent her from bonding with any alpha who might help her realize her true nature, and keep her isolated until the council could determine the best course of action. Damon's grip tightened involuntarily as rage flooded his system like molten metal. The idea that his mate had been deliberately targeted, manipulated, and controlled by creatures who saw her as nothing more than a strategic asset made his wolf howl for blood and vengeance. But beneath the fury ran a current of tactical thinking that couldn't be ignored. If the Shadowmere pack had been watching Seraphina for years, if they'd gone to the trouble of embedding a long-term operative in her life, then other factions were undoubtedly aware of her existence as well. The mate bond that had seemed like a gift from the gods was actually the first move in what would likely become a supernatural war. How many others know? Damon demanded, his voice carrying the kind of alpha command that compelled truth from even the most resistant subjects. How many packs are aware that the Linares bloodline survived? How many operatives do you have in place? Each question was a tactical necessity, but also a knife twist of realization that his mate's life had been shaped by forces beyond her control or understanding. Every relationship she'd formed, every job she'd taken, every decision that had led her to this moment, how much of it had been genuine choice, and how much had been careful manipulation by supernatural predators. Kieran's resistance crumbled completely under the weight of alpha authority backed by barely contained violence. The Eastern Territories know for certain, he gasped, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to provide information that might buy him mercy he didn't deserve. The Gulf Coast Confederation suspects. There are rumors spreading through the Canadian packs about unusual sense signatures appearing in American cities. And the European councils have been asking questions about bloodline survivors for months. It's not just werewolves. There are vampire covens and fae courts that would pay any price to control a direct descendant of the moon goddess. The scope of the conspiracy hit Damon like a physical blow. This wasn't just about pack politics or territorial disputes. This was about supernatural beings across multiple continents recognizing that Seraphina represented either the key to absolute power or the greatest threat to the existing order that had been seen in centuries. The mate bond between them had painted a target on both their backs that would draw enemies from across the globe, all seeking to either claim or eliminate the woman who carried the blood of queens in her veins. Behind him, Seraphina was struggling to process revelations that rewrote her entire understanding of reality. The man she'd trusted, the relationship she'd thought was love, the gradual isolation from her friends and family, all of it had been part of a supernatural conspiracy designed to keep her powerless and unaware of her true nature. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, because it meant that her judgment, her instincts, her ability to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated manipulation, had all been compromised from the very beginning. What was the endgame? Damon pressed, his strategic mind already calculating the implications of what he'd learned. Once you had established complete control over her, once she was isolated and dependent, what was the Shadowmere pack planning to do with her? The question carried deadly implications, because Damon suspected he already knew the answer. A Linares heir under complete psychological control would be the ultimate weapon, capable of commanding loyalty from any werewolf pack, but wielding that power according to the will of her handlers rather than her own divine judgment. Kieran's eyes darted toward the elevator, toward the windows, toward any possible escape route, but Damon's grip held him as immovably as a steel trap. The council wanted her bread, he finally admitted, the words falling into the lobby like stones dropped into still water. Controlled breeding with alpha bloodlines to create a new generation of Linares-touched heirs who could be raised from birth to serve the packs rather than rule them. Her power, but without the inconvenience of independent thought or divine mandate. The confession hit the lobby like a detonation of pure rage. Damon's eyes blazed with golden fire that seemed to burn the air itself, and the temperature around them spiked as his barely contained wolf finally began to break free from its human constraints. The idea that anyone would dare to treat his mate like breeding stock, would plan to strip her of agency and autonomy and reduce her to nothing more than a vessel for producing the next generation of supernatural nobility, triggered every protective instinct he possessed and several he hadn't known existed. But it was Seraphina's reaction that truly shattered the careful control Damon had maintained throughout the confrontation. Behind him, she made a sound that was part sob, part growl, part something that belonged to no human throat. When he glanced back at her, her eyes were blazing with silver fire that had nothing to do with reflected light and everything to do with divine power finally awakening to the threat that had been circling her for years. The Linares bloodline wasn't just stirring, it was fully manifesting, triggered by the revelation of how thoroughly she'd been betrayed and violated by creatures who saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. The silver fire in her eyes reflected off every polished surface in the lobby, creating a light show that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension finally breaking free from the chains of ignorance and manipulation that had bound it for so long. Kieran took one look at her transformed features and began struggling frantically in Damon's grip, finally understanding that he wasn't just facing an angry alpha, he was facing the awakening fury of supernatural royalty that had been deceived, betrayed, and marked for a fate worse than death by creatures who should have been bowing before her divine authority. Chapter 4: The Truth Revealed. Damon released Kieran, who collapsed to the marble floor gasping and clutching his throat, but the alpha's attention was already shifting to Seraphina. She stood frozen behind him, her face pale with shock, brown eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning understanding that made his chest tighten with protective instincts. He'd revealed too much, moved too fast, but seeing that pathetic werewolf operative threaten his mate with a blade had shattered every careful plan he'd made. Now she knew he wasn't human, and the way she was looking at him, like he was a beautiful monster, threatened to tear his heart apart. The silver fire that had blazed in her eyes during the confrontation had faded back to warm brown, but Damon could still sense the power humming beneath her skin like electricity waiting to discharge. His enhanced senses detected the lingering traces of her awakened Linares heritage in her scent, and he knew that what had happened in the lobby was only the beginning of her transformation. Soon, she would manifest abilities that would make her the most sought-after supernatural being in existence, and the knowledge that he was the only thing standing between her and those who would exploit her power made his dual nature writhe with protective fury. "Werewolves," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of her entire worldview crumbling. "You're a werewolf." It wasn't a question, and Damon found himself oddly proud that his mate was quick enough to piece together the impossible truth from the fragments she'd witnessed. He nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact, watching for the moment when fear would override fascination and she'd run from him like prey from a predator. Instead, she took a shaky step closer, her gaze searching his face for answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. But even as he acknowledged her assessment, Damon felt the familiar burn of guilt that came with concealing the full extent of what he truly was. Werewolf was only half the truth, the acceptable half, the part of his nature that could be explained and understood within the framework of pack dynamics and supernatural politics. The other half of his heritage was something far more dangerous, far more forbidden, something that would make her question everything she thought she knew about good and evil, predator and protector, salvation and damnation. "The pack you mentioned," she continued, her voice gaining strength as her mind worked through the implications. "The territory. This building, it's not just an office building, is it?" Damon shook his head, impressed despite himself by how quickly she was adapting to revelations that had driven humans to madness. "It's our headquarters. Hidden in plain sight among the humans who rent office space from us. We own half of downtown Los Angeles, control shipping routes up and down the coast, maintain the balance between the supernatural world and the human one." The truth was even more complex than what he was telling her. The Northern California pack wasn't just another werewolf territory, It was a carefully constructed alliance of supernatural beings who had accepted his leadership despite knowing exactly what kind of monster stood at their head. Werewolves, witches, fey refugees, even a small coven of vampires who had sworn loyalty to him rather than face execution by their own kind for refusing to participate in the endless blood feuds that defined vampire society. He'd built his empire on the principle that power mattered more than purity, that results mattered more than breeding, but he'd never had to explain to someone he loved why he was capable of such unnatural leadership. Kieran was trying to crawl toward the elevator, leaving a trail of blood from his broken wrist, but Damon barely spared him a glance. The Shadowmere operative would be dealt with later, interrogated properly to extract every detail about the conspiracy targeting Seraphina, but right now his focus was entirely on his mate and the way she was processing information that should have sent her screaming into the streets. Her resilience amazed him, but it also terrified him, because it meant she would keep pushing for answers until she learned truths that might destroy the fragile trust building between them. "And me?" she asked quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. "What did you call me?" "Your mate?" The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of tension through the space that separated them. But Damon heard the deeper question beneath her words, the one that made his chest tighten with anticipation and dread. She was asking not just about the mate bond, but about why it had chosen them for each other, what cosmic forces had decided that a supernatural hybrid and a Linares princess belonged together. "In our world," Damon said carefully, taking a half-step closer and stopping when she tensed, "mate bonds are sacred. They're connections forged by the moon goddess herself, linking two souls across any barrier, species, status, distance. When I looked at you last night, when you fell asleep against me, I felt the bond snap into place like a golden thread connecting our hearts." He watched her face, seeing the conflict playing out in her expression as human logic warred with something deeper, more primal. "You felt it too, didn't you? The recognition. The rightness of it." She nodded almost involuntarily, and Damon's wolf howled with triumph while his vampire side purred with satisfaction. His mate might not understand the supernatural world yet, but she felt the pull between them as strongly as he did. But her next question cut through his relief like a silver blade, exposing the wound he'd been trying to keep hidden since the moment he'd first scented her unique heritage. "But why me?" Seraphina asked, her brown eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to confess every secret he'd ever kept. "I'm nobody special. I'm just a maid who cleans office buildings and falls asleep on strangers' shoulders. Why would the universe choose someone like me for someone like you?" The innocent honesty in her question made Damon's heart clench with emotions he'd spent decades learning to suppress, because she truly had no idea what kind of power ran through her veins or why that power would be specifically compatible with his own cursed nature. The guilt that had been gnawing at him since the moment he'd recognized her silver-eyed heritage finally became too heavy to bear. She deserved the truth, not just about what she was, but about what he was and why their bond was more than just cosmic chance. Taking a deep breath that he didn't strictly need, Damon made the decision that would either bind them together forever or drive her away for good. "Because," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of loneliness and self-imposed isolation, "the mate bond doesn't just connect compatible souls. It connects souls that need each other to survive." He paused, watching her face carefully as he prepared to reveal the secret that had shaped every aspect of his existence. "I'm not just a werewolf, Seraphina. I'm a hybrid, half werewolf, half vampire. And that combination should have killed me before I drew my first breath." The words hung in the air between them like a confession whispered in a cathedral, heavy with implications that would reshape everything she thought she knew about the man who had claimed her as his mate. Damon watched her process the revelation, saw the moment when understanding dawned in her eyes and was immediately followed by fear, confusion, and something that might have been fascination. He was a creature that shouldn't exist, an abomination by the standards of both species that had contributed to his genetic makeup, and he was asking her to accept him as her destined partner. Hybrid, she repeated slowly, as if testing the word on her tongue. That's possible? The question carried undertones of scientific curiosity mixed with supernatural acceptance that made Damon's chest tight with hope. She wasn't running. She wasn't screaming. She was trying to understand, which was more than he'd dared to hope for. It shouldn't be, Damon admitted, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for decades. Werewolves and vampires are natural enemies. Our physiologies are incompatible, our magical signatures cancel each other out, our social structures are built on mutual antagonism. When a werewolf and vampire attempt to reproduce, the result is usually either stillbirth or offspring that die within days of being born. He paused, remembering the stories his adoptive father had told him about the dozens of failed attempts that had preceded his miraculous survival. But very rarely, he continued, his golden eyes meeting her brown ones with desperate honesty, maybe once every 1,000 years, the cosmic forces align in such a way that a hybrid not only survives but thrives. We become something more than the sum of our parts, stronger than werewolves, faster than vampires, capable of powers that neither parent species can achieve alone. But we also become something that both species fear and hunt, because our very existence challenges the natural order they've built their societies around. Seraphina's hand moved instinctively to her throat, and Damon saw her remembering the moment when his eyes had blazed with inhuman fire, when his strength had defied human physics, when his presence had made the very air around them thicken with supernatural energy. She was putting together the pieces of a puzzle that revealed her gentle protector as one of the most dangerous creatures in existence, and Damon braced himself for the moment when terror would override trust and she would finally understand what kind of monster had claimed her. "That's why you're so controlled," she said instead, her voice carrying notes of understanding rather than condemnation. "Why you move like you're holding something back, why other supernatural beings are afraid of you. You're not just an alpha, you're something that shouldn't exist, and that makes you unpredictable." The observation was so astute, so free of judgment, that Damon felt something long frozen in his chest begin to thaw. His mate was seeing him clearly for the first time, and instead of running, she was trying to understand. "Every day of my existence is a balancing act," Damon confessed, the words spilling out of him like water from a broken dam. "The wolf wants to hunt and protect and claim territory. The vampire wants to feed and dominate and eliminate threats. The two natures are constantly at war with each other, and if I ever lose control completely, if I ever let both sides manifest simultaneously." He trailed off, unable to voice the carnage that would result from his dual nature breaking free without restraint. "But the mate bond," Seraphina said softly, her intuitive understanding making his heart race with something that might have been love, "it helps stabilize you, doesn't it? That's why the universe chose me specifically. Not just because we're compatible, but because I'm capable of balancing whatever's warring inside you." Her words carried a wisdom that she shouldn't possess, a knowledge that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, and Damon realized that her awakening Linares heritage was already beginning to manifest in ways that went beyond the silver fire in her eyes. "The Linares bloodline," Damon confirmed, his voice thick with reverence and desperate gratitude, "carries a stabilizing influence that can harmonize conflicting supernatural natures. Your ancestors were called the Peacebringers, capable of mediating disputes between species that had been at war for millennia. The silver fire that runs through your veins can literally rewrite the magical signatures of those around you, bringing balance where there was chaos, harmony where there was discord." The revelation hit Seraphina like a physical blow, because it meant that her relationship with Damon wasn't just about love or attraction or even cosmic destiny. She was literally designed to be his salvation, the one force in the universe capable of preventing his dual nature from tearing him apart. But it also meant that his need for her went beyond want or desire. It was a matter of survival, both for him and for everyone around him. "So our bond," she said carefully, her mind working through implications that stretched far beyond personal romance, "isn't just about us being meant for each other. It's about me being the only thing standing between you and complete loss of control. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a mantle she'd never asked for, but as she looked into Damon's golden eyes, she saw not just a powerful predator but a man who had spent his entire existence fighting to remain civilized despite carrying the instincts of two apex predator species. "I won't lie to you," Damon said, his voice carrying the brutal honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I need you in ways that go beyond love, beyond desire, beyond anything human relationships are built on. Without the stabilizing influence of your bloodline, without the harmony your presence brings to my warring natures, I would eventually lose the ability to distinguish between threat and innocent, between protection and predation. You don't just complete me, Seraphina, you save me, every moment of every day." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, offering connection but also revealing the terrifying depths that separated their natures. Seraphina was being asked to accept not just a supernatural mate, but the responsibility of keeping one of the world's most dangerous creatures stable and controlled. It was a burden that would shape every aspect of her future, assuming she was brave enough to accept it. But as she looked at Damon, really looked at him, seeing past the inhuman beauty to the loneliness and desperate hope that lived in his golden eyes, Seraphina felt something shift inside her chest. The silver fire that had manifested during her moment of fury was stirring again, but this time it carried notes of recognition and acceptance rather than defensive power. Her Linares heritage was responding to his hybrid nature not with fear or revulsion, but with the deep satisfaction of a key finding its lock, a missing piece sliding into place in a puzzle that had been incomplete for far too long. "And what happens to me?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying steel beneath the softness. "If I accept this bond, if I become your stabilizing influence, what does that mean for my life, my choices, my freedom?" The question was fair, necessary, and terrifying, because they both knew that binding herself to a hybrid would paint a target on her back that would draw enemies from across the supernatural world. Damon's expression darkened with protective fury as he considered the dangers that would surround her for the rest of her existence. "It means you become the most valuable and most hunted supernatural being alive," he said with brutal honesty. "Every faction that wants to control me will try to claim you. Every enemy that wants to destroy me will try to eliminate you. And every power-hungry creature that learns about your Linares heritage will see you as either a tool to be used or a threat to be neutralized." The scope of the danger should have sent her running, but instead, Seraphina felt a strange sense of rightness settling over her like armor made of starlight. For the first time in her life, she understood why she'd never felt like she belonged in the normal human world, why she'd always sensed there was something larger and more important waiting for her beyond the mundane struggles of survival. She hadn't been born to clean office buildings and accept scraps of affection from men who saw her as disposable. She'd been born to stand beside a king and help him rule a world most humans never knew existed. "But it also means," Damon continued, his voice softening with something that might have been wonder, "that you'll never have to hide what you are again. Never have to make yourself small to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. Never have to accept less than you deserve from people who can't see your true worth." His hand extended toward her, palm up, offering connection without demanding it. "It means coming home to yourself, Seraphina. Finally becoming who you were always meant to be." As she looked at his outstretched hand, at the promise and peril it represented, Seraphina felt the last pieces of her old life crumbling away like sand castles before an incoming tide. She could choose safety, could walk away from this impossible man and his dangerous world, could try to rebuild her human existence somewhere far from supernatural politics and ancient bloodlines. But that would mean abandoning not just Damon, but the part of herself that had awakened in response to his presence, the silver fire that promised power beyond imagination and purpose beyond survival. The choice, when it came, felt less like a decision and more like recognition. She was Seraphina Linares, last daughter of the moon goddess's chosen bloodline, and she was exactly where she belonged. Chapter 5: The Alpha's Victory. Kieran had managed to drag himself halfway to the elevator before Damon's patience finally ran out completely. The pathetic human's whimpering was disturbing his mate, and the scent of Kieran's blood was triggering hunting instincts that Damon was barely keeping in check. With a low growl that reverberated through the marble lobby like distant thunder, he stalked over to where Kieran cowered against the wall, his broken wrist cradled against his chest like a wounded bird. When Damon crouched down to meet his eyes, the human's face went white with terror. "Listen very carefully," Damon said, his voice carrying the alpha command that could bring entire packs to their knees. "You're going to disappear from Seraphina's life completely. Cancel the apartment lease, close any shared accounts, delete her number from your phone. If I see you within 100 miles of Los Angeles, if I catch even a hint of your scent near anything she touches, I will hunt you down and show you what happens when prey runs from a predator." His eyes flashed golden fire, and for just a moment, he let his wolf bleed through, enough to show Kieran the beast that lived beneath his human skin. Kieran nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet and stumbling toward the elevator like a man fleeing from his own death. The doors closed behind him with a soft chime, and Damon felt the satisfying knowledge that this particular threat to his mate had been neutralized permanently. No human male would ever be foolish enough to challenge a werewolf alpha twice, especially not one who demonstrated his willingness to break bones for the crime of threatening what belonged to him. When he turned back to Seraphina, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, part fascination, part fear, part something that might have been admiration. "Is he gone for good?" she asked, and there was hope in her voice that made Damon's chest tight with protective tenderness. "Forever," he confirmed, crossing the space between them with careful, measured steps. "He'll never hurt you again, Seraphina. I give you my word as Alpha." She nodded slowly, then surprised him by asking, "What happens now?" "I don't have anywhere to go, no money, no job since I'm pretty sure I just missed my shift." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, and Damon felt his world tilt on its axis again. Even after everything she'd witnessed, the violence, the supernatural revelations, the complete upheaval of everything she thought she knew about reality, his mate was thinking practically about her future. "You come home with me," he said simply, extending his hand palm up between them like an offering. "You let me take care of you the way mates are meant to care for each other. You let me show you what it feels like to be treasured instead of possessed." When she placed her small hand in his, Damon Blackthorne knew he was holding his entire world. 6 months later, Seraphina stood on the balcony of Damon's penthouse, watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean in shades of rose and gold that painted the sky like a masterpiece. She wore a midnight blue dress that cost more than she'd made in a year as a maid, her hair swept up in an elegant style that made her feel like a fairy tale princess. But the most precious thing she wore was the delicate silver necklace at her throat, Damon's claiming mark, designed to look like jewelry to human eyes but carrying his scent and protection for any supernatural creature who might encounter her. The past half-year had been a whirlwind of discovery and wonder as she'd learned to navigate the hidden world of werewolves, vampires, and magic that existed parallel to human society. Damon had been patient and gentle, teaching her pack customs and supernatural politics while she adjusted to being the mate of the most powerful alpha on the West Coast. She'd found her place in his world, using her experience with cleaning and organization to help manage pack businesses, earning the respect of his lieutenants through her quick mind and compassionate heart. For the first time in her life, she felt truly valued, truly loved, truly safe. "What are you thinking about?" Damon's voice came from behind her, warm and familiar as his arms wrapped around her waist. She leaned back against his chest, still marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to be held by someone who saw her as precious rather than disposable. "Just remembering that night in the lobby," she said softly. "How scared I was, how alone I felt. I never imagined that falling asleep on a stranger's shoulder would change my entire life." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she felt his contentment through the mate bond that had grown stronger every day. The pack council wants to meet with you tomorrow, Damon murmured against her hair, and she heard the slight tension in his voice that meant pack politics were becoming complicated again. As his mate, she held a position of influence that some of the older wolves still weren't entirely comfortable with, a human woman who'd gained power through love rather than birthright or conquest. But she'd proven herself time and again, and most of the pack now accepted her as their Luna. They want to discuss expanding territory into Northern California, he continued. There are rumors that the Redwood Pack is planning something. Seraphina nodded, already mentally preparing for the diplomatic dance that came with inter-pack negotiations. She discovered she had a talent for reading people and situations, skills that served her well in the dangerous world of supernatural politics. But as she turned in Damon's arms to kiss him, a movement in the shadows far below caught her eye. A figure stood on the sidewalk across the street, perfectly still despite the flow of evening pedestrians around them. Even from 40 stories up, she could see the gleam of golden eyes that weren't quite the same shade as Damon's, and something cold settled in her stomach like a premonition of danger. Damon, she whispered, but when she looked down again, the figure was gone. The street looked normal, filled with humans heading home from work, but the feeling of being watched lingered like ice in her veins. For the first time in months, Seraphina felt the old fear creeping back. The knowledge that happiness was fragile, that safety was temporary, that somewhere in the shadows, something was always waiting to steal away everything she'd learned to love. As Damon followed her gaze to the empty street below, his arms tightened around her protectively, and she knew he'd felt it too. For the first time, Seraphina felt safe in Damon's arms, but in the shadows of the city, another pair of golden eyes had already chosen her fate.